2022 was a relatively slow reading year for me, but life is hard, and I'm okay with reading fewer books if that means living my life and taking care of my loved ones. As Stephen Patrick Morrissey says in Handsome Devil, there's more to life than books, but not much more. So here's the whole lot. Every book I read in 2022 with a mini review for each. I'm going to start with the worst 5 books of the year and work up from there. So here it goes. The Fireman by Joe Hill. First of all, I had a lot to say about this book right after I read it and wrote a 2,200 word note on my writing diary about it. But since I'm already putting it on the list of the worst books I read all year, just let me say a few nice things about it. This is direct from my reading diary. Joe Hill is good with words. He can turn a phrase when a phrase needs to be turned. He can send chills up my spine when I least expect it. I'm seriously impressed with his powers of language, but where he's a great writer, in this case at least, he failed as a storyteller, which is a shame because the premise of this novel was excellent. I was intrigued from the start. Every description, in the beginning at least, of the dragon scale infection got my imagination running at the red line. How the Internet Works by Preston Gralla. I shouldn't really be too hard on this book. It was a textbook about the internet published 20 years ago, so I probably could have done myself a favor and found something more relevant to get acquainted with how the internet works. Jaws by Peter Benchley. This is a clear case of the movie improving upon the book. Inside this messy nest of narratives is a good novella, but reading a 300-page book to get to it was a waste. I can't recommend anyone read Jaws unless you're trying to learn how to adapt a book for film. Peter Benchley and Carl Gottlieb wrote the 1975 screenplay, and they did a remarkable job brushing out the knots and ended up writing one of the greatest thriller scripts of all time. The Eighth Detective by Alex Pavesi. Alex Pavesi wrote an article for Crime Reads called The Joys of Mystery Fiction's Most Enduring Tropes. I loved this article, and at the end I was excited to discover that the author had prepared this article in promotion of his new book, The Eighth Detective. I found the book at the library, read it quickly, but was left feeling like I'd been duped. The book was sloppy, boring, trite, badly written. It had at its heart an almost gripping premise of exploring mystery's most enduring tropes by introducing a mystery writer working with an editor going over a series of his old mystery short stories. Meanwhile, another mystery was unraveling in the present about the past. If the idea had been mine, I would have enthusiastically written this novel too. Unfortunately, The Eighth Detective just didn't work for me on any level, and upon reading the final pages, I literally threw the book across the room. The Cartographers by Peng Shepherd. My mother and I read this one together, and we texted one another back and forth with our theories along the way, and we thought it'd be a bit of fun, but neither one of us ended up liking this book at all. I'm not going to linger on this one for too long because of all the books I read in 2022, I was most disappointed in The Cartographers. I had such high hopes for this one, and the premise of magical map making could have offered so much more. When I finished reading, I sent my mother one of the longest texts of my life. Recreated here, I tracked it down on my phone, and so I'm just going to let it scroll over the screen really fast. But when my mother finished reading The Cartographers, she texted me something of similar length, and after listing many of her own frustrations, she wrapped up by saying, "But I don't even want to think about it anymore." And that about sums it up. Okay, the following books range from slightly below average, maybe, to well above average. I tend to read the books I think I'm going to like anyway, like everyone else. So an average book for me is a book that I was right about, a book that I liked and was worth reading. These books are presented in the order I read them throughout the year. An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro. Kazuo Ishiguro is a phenomenal writer, but it feels to me that the full weight of his brilliance only shines through once in a while. Other of his books were better than An Artist of the Floating World, but if I didn't compare this book to his other works, if this was an author I'd never heard before, I would have thought Floating World was a slow-paced but thoughtful and provocative book about a culture I'm totally unfamiliar with. I appreciate the main thrust of the story. A man of preeminent standing before and during World War II now finds himself on the wrong side of the political zeitgeist, even if his views have changed over time, which I'm not sure is the relevant idea here. The fact is, he once held beliefs that are now unpopular in Japan, and for that, his family has fallen out of favor, and even his daughter expects him to perform seppuku as his final dutiful act as the patriarch. It's a compelling idea, but unfortunately this concept is explored through a slowly plotted, unrelatable marriage investigation for one of his daughters. Ishiguro's prose is easy on the brain and very enjoyable to read moment by moment. However, I just never found myself totally invested in the story or in the characters. Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. I admit I didn't get a lot out of this one, but it's no fault of Stephen Crane's. I listened to this on audiobook while on the road home during a family emergency. It's hard to allow oneself to be absorbed into its fabric if only approached with half a mind. However, the parts of the book that weaved into my awareness were profound, and the book seemed to live up to its reputation. I understood what the Red Badge was, and that the protagonist was not the typical boy adventurer war hero. But beyond that, I missed a lot, and I know I need to do this book justice and return to it sometime soon when I can pay more attention to it. The Three Musketeers and the Red Sphinx by Alexander Dumas. Originally, I was going to read all 9 books of the Musketeer cycle as translated and edited by Lawrence Ellsworth. These books started coming out in 2020. Unfortunately, they're not all out yet, and I faltered after book 2, The Red Sphinx. I loved these books for the most part, but my mind wandered at some of the longer passages. Dumas was paid by the word for these books, and he was paid well. Once all these books have been released, I'm going to collect them and read them all, and I'm very much looking forward to that adventure. On Revision, The Only Writing That Counts, William Germano. Like most writing books, a few months after I read On Revision, I forgot specifically what I gleaned from this one book. I remember enjoying this read, however, and would recommend it to any would-be writer, but I read it last April, and I can't tell you anything about it at this point. There Are Trans People Here by H. Melt. This was a book of poetry I picked up on an LGBTQ display at the public library. It contained relatively few poems, but I read them slowly, one at a time. I kept the book in my car and read them as I went about my day, thinking about them individually after reading them. I was moved by H. Melt's powerful language and appreciated the glimpse into their world. I should read more poetry. This is the only poetry I read all year. All right, Star Wars, The Joiner King by Troy Denning. This is the first book in a Star Wars trilogy that I didn't finish. I read Troy Denning's work in the Halo universe and liked it a lot, and I quite liked The Joiner King, but never did get on with the other books in the series. If I can find a good time to do so this year, I'd like to finish the trilogy. This book explores what would happen if a Force user was absorbed into a hive mind. It's very interesting stuff. And Star Wars, Snare of Delusion by Philip Diaz. This Star Wars novel features Han Solo and Wedge Antilles on a remote, difficult-to-access military outpost. This outpost is invaded by an insidious army that absorbs its foes into its own ranks. Also, there's railguns. Very cool stuff on the military sci-fi side. And can't wait for more novels by the Diaz here. The Highway Kind is a collection of 15 short stories by various authors, all about automobiles. I listened to this one on audiobook in my automobile. Anytime you anthologize 15 wildly different authors, it's inevitable that the collection will be hit and miss. There are famous authors here like Michael Connelly, who reuses a character fans of his work will know and love, But me never having read Connolly before, don't have that established connection with the character, so the story kind of went over my head. Now that I mention it, I had never read anything by any of these authors ever before, and as I said, some of these stories stood out more than others, and there were a few stinkers in my opinion, but for my money, the best story of the bunch was Fogmeister by Diana Gabaldon, a story she called from real life about Nazis sabotaging their own national hero race car driver for the crime of disloyalty to the party. A Bright Ray of Darkness was the best fiction I've ever read by a movie star. This was another audiobook for me, and I listened to it on long summer walks along the Des Moines River while recovering from a period of depression. In fact, as soon as it finished, I started it over and listened to it again from the beginning. I almost never do that. Ethan Hawke sets his movie star main character in a tumultuous time in his own life. His marriage has fallen apart, he's a pariah in the headlines, and he's desperate to prove himself in his Broadway debut, a stage production of Henry IV. Hawke's got authorial chops, assuming he wrote A Bright Ray of Darkness himself, and really nails emotional turmoil. He also reads the audiobook and just totally nails that performance as well. Just like Germano's On Revision, I can't remember anything specific from Walter Mosley's This Year You Write Your Novel, even though this was the second time I read this book. It was okay, probably worth reading, and I'm sure I internalized something from this book. I'd like to play Alone Please by Tom Segura. Almost without exception, Tom Segura's book of essays are just retellings of stories he tells on stage. I've watched a lot of Tom Segura on YouTube and Netflix, so I basically knew every story in this book already. However, he adds some details and some zingers here that make the book zoom along wonderfully. It's definitely worth reading if you like his comedy, but Tom isn't for everyone. I acknowledge that. This was my second time reading Thoreau's long essay Walking. I read this in the backseat of a Honda Civic on my way to the Tetons. I have a lot more to say about this in another video called 5 Books, 5 States, link in the description, but finish watching this video first, though. I made a video about Fairy Tale by Stephen King a while back. Link to that is also in the description. It's a long video, as I had a lot to say about the book, but if I had to boil the review down to one sentence, I would say that Fairy Tale does not live up to its potential, but it's alright. The Velvet Underground and Nico by Joe Harvard. I bought this book at the Sub Pop store at the SeaTac airport. 33 1/3 has a long series of short books about classic albums, and I'd love to own so many of them. I bought 3 of these books, and this is the first one I read. I probably listened to this Velvet Underground debut album 10 times while reading the book about its origins. Maybe that's a weird thing to do, but that's what I did. I get a lot out of music, and I enjoy reading about production myths and personality clashes. From Andy Warhol's legendary involvement and tangential stories about people like Edie Sedgwick and the Factory crowd, I found endless points of interest here. I can't wait to read the other books in the series. So many albums, so many stories. Unthinkable, Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy by Jamie Raskin. Jamie Raskin is a congressman from Maryland and served on the United States House Select Committee on the January 6th attack. He was appointed to that leadership role very shortly after his son Tommy committed suicide. Unthinkable is the book that describes the convergence of those two events as Raskin sorts out the current state of democracy in America. Obviously and unavoidably, this is a political novel, but I found myself totally engrossed in this narrative and only very rarely put off by Raskin's slip into partisan rhetoric. This book was moving as it was informative, and for bonus points, Raskin reads his own audiobook. Troubled Blood by Robert Galbraith. So, I was curious to know if J.K. Rowling's neoliberal, pro-establishment, anti-change politics made it into her current books, or if that's just why she wrote Harry Potter. As it turns out, I quite liked Troubled Blood, despite it being the 5th book in the Cormoran Strike mystery series and not having read any of the others. I'm still opposed to the comments Rowling continues to make in public, but she didn't give me anything else to seethe over in her well-plotted, intriguing mystery novel. She uses Twitter for that. America and the Castle by Franz Kafka. These books have been on my TBR since I first read The Trial in the year 2000. Kafka died before finishing any of his novels, The Trial being the most complete. But where The Trial ends abruptly, America and The Castle quite simply cut off. The Castle famously ends mid-sentence. While Kafka's short stories and other writings elsewhere give me a lot to return to, I most likely will not return to either of these novels. Different as they were both exhausting to get through. America follows a young teen named Carl who is banished to America by his European family for fathering an illegitimate child with a housekeeper. We follow Carl through New York City and environs in this comic novel as each strange encounter with Americans seem only to make Carl's plight worse. The collected miscellaneous scenes at the end of the book, though disparate from the main plot, tell us that Kafka had something particularly strange in mind for Carl should he have finished the novel. In The Castle, a land surveyor called only K from a faraway unnamed city comes to a small, snowy, unnamed village at the bequest of the local authorities in residence at the eponymous castle. However, he's denied work in the village by minor town officials, so refusing to return whence he came, K resolves to assert his right to be here. 481 pages pass in which K attempts to gain employment and residency in the village, all the while attempting to gain an audience at the castle. Perhaps because it was never in Kafka's plans or because he never finished the book, K does not reach the castle. Intentionally or unintentionally, this ineffectualness is textbook Kafka and has frustrated many a casual reader. But as Goodreads reviewer Fergus Quondam Happyface says of both America and the Castle, it's not about us. It's about something bigger. And indeed, the value of these stories is wallowing in the broken worlds and trying to suss out just what is really going on. Kafka's masterful use of language plumbs the deepest depths of his hermetic creations. Unfortunately for me, by the time I finished The Castle, I was too exhausted even to wallow anymore. Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance by Jeff Vandermeer. Jeff Vandermeer's 3 novels from 2014 comprise the Southern Reach trilogy. The first book, Annihilation, was the basis of the 2018 film starring Natalie Portman, Oscar Isaac, Tessa Thompson, and Jennifer Jason Leigh. And just like I concluded with Jaws by Peter Benchley, this is a rare example of when the movie is better than the book. But a significant difference here is that Vandermeer's book is actually worth reading. I just feel he got bogged down in plot contrivances like mind control through hypnosis, nameless characters, and biological observations, which would have been terrific in a different kind of novel, which only distracted from or unnecessarily complicated the exploration of larger themes such as navigating one's unreliable perceptions and exploration and interpretation of the self. The other 2 books in the trilogy were fine but peripheral. Vandermeer had already said what I think he had set out to say with the first book. The follow-ups lack restraint and attempt to answer irrelevant questions about the shadowy government agency in charge of Area X. Authority and Acceptance are immaterial to the nature of Annihilation on every level except surface plot. They do not share the same metaphorical meanings. Books 2 and 3 downgrade the trilogy from philosophical literary sci-fi to pulp genre fiction. Nothing against genre fiction. I love Star Wars novels, for example, but Vandermeer had something special with Annihilation and just couldn't resist messing with it. Alright, so the final 7 books on this list were the best books I read in 2022, presented here in no particular order. First up, we've got The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And what's to be said about The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings that hasn't already been said 10,000 times already? I love rereading these books every 5 years or so. I always pick up new information. I would eventually like to expand into other of J.R.R. Tolkien's writings about Middle-earth. I just never quite have a window large enough in my reading schedule to squeeze in 12 volumes of maximalist lore. But if there's a world I'm willing to explore in such a way, it's Tolkien's. The Sea is My Brother by Jack Kerouac. The Sea is My Brother stands outside of Kerouac's Romaniclef Delua Legends cycle of novels, but it's no less about himself, even if it divides himself up among various characters. The Sea is My Brother was written 7 years before The Town and the City, his first published novel, and word is Kerouac hated this book. It was lost for many years and only published in 2011, 42 years after Kerouac died. In a lot of ways, the book reads like an early, unedited novel. Mixed tenses, confusing attributions, and typos litter the work, but these hardly mattered to me, or to other readers for that matter. Goodreads reviewer Madeline says, the book to her felt like listening to a stripped-down acoustic performance, and I couldn't agree more. While Kerouac's signature ecstatic, spontaneous prose isn't yet evident in The Sea is My Brother, the hard-drinking, intensely conversant, spontaneous living of the characters is present. All Kerouac hallmarks. I've read this book 3 times now, and I know I'll return to this one again and again. The Salt Path by Raynor Winn. I reviewed The Salt Path for my 5 books, 5 states video. Raynor Winn wrote this book about a period of homelessness her husband Moth and she experienced after losing their farm to a family friend in a protracted legal battle. Ray and Moth decide to walk the Southwest Coast Path in southwest England, a 630-mile footpath. Now, I love a good book about long-distance walking, but this book was something more than an adventure novel. The Salt Path was a compassionate and thoughtful first-hand look into the humanity of the free-sleeping, houseless people among us. I am in love with this book. No Country for Old Men, Cormac McCarthy. A lot has been said about Cormac McCarthy, and I feel a little silly reviewing such a highly acclaimed book, but here it goes. I'm currently reading The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy, and finding that what I loved about No Country for Old Men is also true about The Passenger. I'm not sure I've met anyone in real life who speaks like the characters in Cormac McCarthy's novels, but then again, I don't know that I'd love a book with actually realistic, mundane dialogue. McCarthy's dialogue, on the other hand, reaches off the page and slaps me across the face. I don't know about you, but I love being slapped in the face when I read a book. But beyond the dialogue, the underlying theme of No Country for Old Men, that the world is becoming a harder place to live in peace, was captivating and compelling. And just tremendous characters from the top to the bottom of the plot. From the stoically violent antagonist Anton Chigurh to the competent and driven protagonist Llewellyn Moss and his wonderfully authentic young wife Carla Jean, to the hard-boiled but aging sheriff Ed Tom Bell, even all the way down to the young boys who witnessed Chigurh's car accident at the end of the novel. Every character is wonderfully distinct from the others. No Country for Old Men is a fantastically plotted, beautifully written novel. I started reading Moonglow, a fictionalized memoir of the author's grandparents, when it was published in 2016, but got distracted and never finished it. I picked it back up in 2022 and had my old bookmark marking my progress. But after 6 years, I'd forgotten a good deal about the book and so started over from the beginning. This time, I read it all at once, probably in 4 or 5 sittings. And while this is not my favorite Chabon novel, I loved this one and was really catapulted into the lives of the author's grandmother and grandfather, no matter how fictionalized they may have become for this book. It never fails when I read Michael Chabon's work. He makes me want to write. There's no other writer out there who inspires me to write my own books more than Michael Chabon. And finally, we come to it. The best book I read in 2022. The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This book was published in 1992, and I'm only now getting to it. It makes me wonder how many absolutely brilliant books are out there waiting for me to read. And if I think about it too hard, I start feeling really quite desperate. Now, I want to do a deeper dive into this book in a later video, namely talking about my unpopular opinion that most spoilers do not truly spoil a novel. And this book is a grade A example of that. So make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss that video. You'll want to hear more about this opinion of mine, if only to yell at me in the comments about it. But anyway, for now, I'll just say that The Secret History is a novel of murder set in an idyllic New England collegiate setting. It centers around a group of pretentious Greek students, and the protagonist is a new student lying about his family's wealth and prestige to fit in with these bougie students. In truth, they're all unlikable brats and murderers to boot, but I just loved how Donna Tartt got me wholly sucked into their world and even kind of had me rooting for them. It's incredible how her command of language could make me do that. In the end, Donna Tartt makes good on all the promises she makes to the reader, as the resolution of the book is monumentally superb. I'll leave it at that. So there you have it. Everything I read in 2022. 38 books. Most of them pretty good. Some of them fantastic. This video turned out to be longer than I expected it to be. I was going to attach a bit at the end of this video about everything I watched in 2022, but I've been advised to split that into its own video. So links in the description for that video and others as well, and I will see you in the next one.